تلاقيتم يعني كأنتك إيش يقول لتومبن تقيبة. Hello y'all, how y'all doing? I'm doing great because today I am going to teach y'all about the new writing system, the modern script since 1984 for Yucatec Maya. So before we get into the new writing system with the Latin alphabet, I just want to quickly acknowledge that before colonization, since let the record state about 200, 300 BCE, Maya peoples were writing within the Mesoamerican tradition in the syllabary as well as with many logograms. So here's just a few examples of what that looked like. Very iconographic. You can see there's bats, fish, centipedes, just to name a few. And so here's some logograms, mayaglyphs.org if you want more information and interact with that. But all of that was taken away through the violence and colonial domination, particularly in the 1500s, but may have lasted as long as into the early 1700s in pockets around particularly Petén, which is northern Guatemala. But here's just an example of one of the friars, Diego de Lambda, who is infamous for burning hundreds of books written in this pre-colonial Maya writing. And then he got a little curious and didn't understand it, so he thought it was an alphabet. Here's his attempt at thinking it was an alphabet, and this is essentially the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone that we have. But nonetheless, before the writing system and the tradition of writing in Yucatan was actually destroyed, the early Spanish missionaries taught the scribal class of the Maya kingdoms in Yucatan how to write with the Latin writing system. So there really is a continuous writing tradition. And so in the early colonial period, 1600s, up until the late 20th century, we are almost exclusively writing in the Latin alphabet. And as you can see here, there's a very unequal or unstandardized, I should say, orthography among the ages up until 1984, which is by my teacher, Fidencio Briceño Chel. He's really the one that has forwarded the standardization of Maya writing for Yucatec Maya. And so here all the way on the right is his alphabet, which he wrote a whole book on. So here's the example from his book, Ts'íib ta'al Mayatan, or in English, Norms for Writing Mayatan, Yucatec Maya. And so the problem is that for a lot of examples, before the 80s or leading up until the publishing of his book, it's a very unstandardized writing system. So as you can see here, this was a book published in 82, and there's some inconsistencies. For example, here's the word che, and then here's the word again in a compound, but is missing the glottal represented by a apostrophe at the end. So coloche, but is written as if it could be pronounced coloche, or actually coloche, without the glottal at the end, cutting it off. And so that would be a Hispanification of the pronunciation. As well as you can see other inconsistencies. Commonly, there is the W is represented as a U, which can be confusing, although that is consistent with the colonial writing standards. It's not exactly a vowel when we consider the word structure of Maya words being consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonants, as well as other inconsistencies like, for example, here he writes suku'une, but instead of writing the rearticulated vowel as an apostrophe in the middle, he has a dash, which he doesn't really use elsewhere. And so probably the biggest inconsistency with these previous writing systems is their representations of vowels between different words, which can be very important because it can the difference in a vowel in a word can reflect the aspect or tense or mood of the word at times. So, chak can be different from chak, can be different from chak. And this author, he tries to like clarify right here. It says that he puts accents at the end to indicate the emphasis on the pronunciation, which is consistent with Spanish orthography, but is not. But since there isn't a standard orthography for Maya, it's not being very consistent. And then he also, is clarifying here that like people have different spellings, and this is largely because people there is no like efforts to standardize spelling, nor is there largely, nor is the population largely literate in writing Maya. Perhaps those that are literate in Spanish are attempting to write Maya, and then so they write, instead of writing ok, which would be the correct way under the standardization to write and pronounce the word for clothes. He says it seems to also be acceptable that people write it as pok, which, if you read that as it's written as pok, or pok, instead of ok, actually it wouldn't be understandable to speakers. And so let's just look real quick at what the vowels that are now standardized look like, because this is the biggest inconsistency pre-standardization. So you have the vowels that are relatively similar to Spanish, so a, e, I, o, u. And so the U is actually a little deeper in the throat, depending on an individual's accent or idiolect, I should say, or their regional dialect of the Yucatec Maya language. Vowels can also be long, which does change the meaning of words often. So a, e, I, o, u, as well as a high tone as described by most native speakers, as well as teachers, Maya teachers, as well as teachers within the peninsula. So a, e, I, o, u. And so I want to actually note here that from a linguistic perspective, it's more accurate to describe this as a falling tone, as represented by how the first vowel has the accent connoting that it's high and then it falls to a lower. And so here example is a graph of what it actually sounds like. So you start high, go low on the pitch. So choy, choy, compared to a long vowel, which would be similar length, but is not changing in pitch. So soom, soom. Finally, of course, people also consider having a vowel to have a glottal stop at the end to be another type way to modify the vowel. So a, e, I, o, u, and that's usually people teach it like that because that's unfamiliar to Spanish speakers as well as English speakers. And then there's the rearticulated version, which our friend from the early 80s was writing with a dash, but we consistently now write it with a apostrophe. So I, o. And yeah, that's what the writing system looks like now. So just for a little reading here, we say Te yash tumben kava oku yesalo uchik paha bish umeya bel utial kahok ok le tumben an tush kutak pahalo titun ku het ele behe kutalbal tibel tumben Tumen kaach bine kuya alal binel baale kaalikik uman le habobo kahpin uhelpal utial kapatak chenpel he elbish kaholaan takpehlae. Here, the author Briseño Chel, doctor, I should say, he's describing how the word, how over time the word for bel, which means path, has changed to beh, and how previously it used to be pronounced binel. But here, it's really great that this book, Nuuk Besail Ts'íib Ta'al Mayatan, has the entire book written both in Spanish and in Maya, so you can truly see how this writing system is meant to be used, the standardization. So we'll just read this next part. Ichil ulak ba'al shane te nupa an anob tush kuchik pahal le chowak humilwoho te tu yasht anilo le helowo ku kontalo leken nupukob ti ulak ano ku bisik shan le ulak he las humilwohoba. And then, so essentially he's saying here is that in compound words, sometimes the length of a vowel or the tone of a vowel can change depending on what words are compounding. So he's saying long vowels, chowak humilwohob, chowak katnalkab humilwohob, and then that's for high tones. And then yan tu kuptaan humilwohob. So rearticulated vowels. And I just kind of want to analyze this a little bit. So what is the point? Why are we standardizing the Latin alphabet for Maya writing? And what are the possible pros and cons? So a big pro here is that with this writing system, we can represent what people are pronouncing with far more precision than any of the previous writing systems. So not only with all the colonial variations, is there like a lot of inconsistency in glottalized versions of consonants, particularly as well as different vowels. But there's also even in the pre-colonial Maya writing system, the logosyllabic script that we looked at the very beginning, that also doesn't necessarily tell you too much about pronunciation of specific vowel, how it doesn't separate for you how a vowel is specifically pronounced. A lot of the times there's ambiguity. And so this writing system by Fidencio Briseño Chel really defines that for us. And so it gives us more rigor when representing the spoken language, as well as is essentially been created for this academic register of the language. So when we are printing books, or when we're writing signs in museums, we, since the 80s, it's common practice to use this standardized writing system. Although I will say throughout the literate Maya speaking population, there is still some incongruencies. A lot of people are familiar with the previous writing systems, and in fact, some of the words, written words that in Maya that people are most familiar with, for example, town names as well as last names, are most commonly written in the sky from in this writing system. So you'll see a lot of names like Ts'íib, which is written with a DZ, which can throw off people not familiar with the orthography of the Latin alphabet for Yucatec Maya, as well as for town names. For example, one town name is named Yucatec, and so it's written with the DZ as well, and it's written with a K, but the K's are glottalized, whereas other towns like Cauquel is written with a C when the K is not glottalized. And so without learning in this language, in this orthography, people can really confuse the previous orthography used to create place names and last names to the modern orthography, which is far more consistent in describing pronunciation, but it doesn't have that historical basis that the townspeople are familiar with. And I guess another downfall I want to describe about this writing system is that with this standardization process with the Latin alphabet, in a way, we are, people that are working on the standardization are dictating how the words are supposed to be pronounced. And so in Yucatec Maya, there's arguably 3 to 5 dialects within the language, not to mention like town-to-town variation, person-to-person variation in pronunciation, which can also, which is often reflected in how they pronounce words if they use long vowels or high tones. So not only is the variation in the language or within the dialects, between the dialects, expressed with the variation in the length of vowels and the type of vowel, its qualities. But vowels will also express, like I mentioned previously, aspect and mood changes. I'm sorry, I think I said tense earlier, not tense. Aspect and mood. And so, in a way, the standardization, as many standardization projects do, has the potential to erase local identities and variation. However, it also has the potential to express or to really codify these variations within the language when used descriptively rather than prescriptively, aka when it's used to truly represent how people are pronouncing words rather than telling people how they should be pronouncing words, which is a whole nother topic because there's just the project of standardization and language revitalization has a lot of aspects to it. So thank you for sticking around this long. and please subscribe for more.